You got the slides?
Hello, Judith. This is Dušica. We were writing each other in these months earlier, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of our network and from all the guests, which I would like that they also either wave to you or give some sign that we really like that you are there. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Welcome, and I just give floor to you.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me as part of your conference. I thought that what I would like to do is share something that I've been working on for a while. And this is really a thought experiment, if you will, because it's imagining a better world. And what I have been thinking about and talking with survivors about is what would justice look like if survivors mattered, if survivors had their way, if survivors could say what would make things right to the extent that anything can. I mean, nothing can erase the harm that was done, but what could make up for it in some degree? And so I have been interviewing survivors of sexual and domestic violence, gender-based violence. These are the people that I have worked with all my life. And but really I think of gender-based violence as an extreme example of a kind of violence that's endemic to societies because it's an expression of the dominance of men over women, the patriarchal culture. And so you could extrapolate to some degree, I think, to any situation in which one group of people subordinates another, whether on the basis of gender or religion or ethnicity or political affiliation, and where violence becomes part of the culture, not even, almost invisible, as a means of both expressing dominance and perpetuating it. So here is the resolution from Beijing in 1995, where Hillary Clinton famously said, women's rights are human rights. And this will not come as a surprise to any of you who are part of this conference. But just as an example, I've shown you the prevalence of sexual assault in our country. This is a famous study that was done jointly by our Justice Department and our Communicable Disease Center, CDC, which is our sort of public health government agency. And this was a random sample of 8,000 men and 8,000 women in the US in the late 90s. And as you see, it's, as in many studies, basically about 20% of women will say they've been raped. I want to emphasize that this is a study done in peacetime in a prosperous country. And if you were to look at a country that is involved in civil war or in a totalitarian country, in a dictatorship, then these numbers would undoubtedly be much higher. And I also want to show you that the numbers are pretty stable. This is a similar study that was done in 2014, so almost 20 years later. And the numbers are in the same ballpark. From the earlier study, and this again will not come as a surprise to you, over 20% of the victims of rape said their first experience was when they were under 12. And then the next highest risk group is from 12 to 17, and then from 18 to 24 years. If you manage to get to age 25 without having been sexually assaulted, your odds improve. So it's women and girls who are at highest risk. Also, just to be clear, and this is also not often understood, and this shows the gender of the perpetrator, when men are victimized, again, they are mostly victimized by older or stronger men. And this adds, I think, a layer of shame and secrecy to the experience of male survivors. This shows numbers for physical assault, mostly domestic violence, and assault by an intimate partner. Again, women 22%, men 7.5%. I also wanted to call your attention to some of the more severe forms of violence, like beat up, 8.5% of the women, less than 1% of the men, to show the extreme differential when you're looking at extreme forms of violence, like choked or tried to drown, smothering, threatened with a gun or a knife. And I don't know if you're familiar with the violence wheel. This is a graphic that came from a domestic violence program here in the US in Duluth, Minnesota. And it's a graphic that's used to explain that all the various forms of coercive control are in the service of establishing and maintaining dominance over the victim, but violence is only one of the means, and many other types of control are used in terms also, and this applies to child victims as well. So violence doesn't need to be used very often, it just needs to be convincing. And the other forms involve verbal shaming and also manipulating relationships, so that, for example, many early studies of incest in our country noted that incestuous families were socially isolated, but of course what wasn't clear is that the isolation is imposed by the perpetrator to protect his dominion, if you will. So it's not uncommon for sexually abused kids to be prevented from visiting friends or having friends come over, or even leaving the house without permission. It won't surprise you also, given the prevalence of violence against women and girls, that if you look at the prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder, you'll see that, and these are numbers again from the US, but I would bet that if you looked at other countries with similar social structure, you would see the same kinds of proportions where women have twice the prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder, and basically 10% of women in the US have PTSD. So, given that violence is endemic, it seems to be there seems to be little change in the prevalence. What does one do about it? Here's a resolution from human rights special rapporteurs from the UN. And I should say that one of the things that has changed is that we do now have United Nations resolution supposedly obliging countries to do something about gender-based violence. The US is, I think, one of the only countries that has not signed on to the United Nations resolution on eliminating all forms of violence against women. But be that as it may, we at least have a statement of our hopes, our expectations of what we want to do to change the world. So the special rapporteurs say that violence against women happens everywhere, and the problem of impunity is found everywhere, so that it is an aspirational statement about ending impunity and bringing perpetrators to justice. Okay, but what would justice mean? Supposedly, and here where the issue always comes up is, if you allow victims to have a say in what justice means, will they be vengeful? So here's a statement from Ari Nair, one of the founders of Human Rights Watch, saying basically it's up to the state or to the society to take charge of the project of obtaining justice. But does that happen, in fact? Here are some data from our country, again in the 90s, but I would, again, more recent data. I didn't update this slide because the more recent data are comparable. We know, and this is for adult sexual assault, of course for child abuse, the numbers are even lower. But I took the highest estimates of reporting, somewhere between 25 and 30%. Many studies show a lower percentage of reporting, but okay, let's take the highest percentage and then cut it down by the number that actually are arrested, and if arrested, prosecuted. In our legal system, the police have quite a bit of discretion about who they arrest, and prosecutors have quite a bit of discretion about what cases they choose to bring forward, and victims have no say about this. So by the time you get down to the percentage that are convicted, it's between 5 and 10%, and those are top estimates. Actually sentenced to prison, the top estimate would be 5%, and actually I think it's really less than 1%. So for the kinds of endemic violence that we're talking about, our justice system absolutely fails to deliver, to render perpetrators accountable. Under 5% or under of cases really doesn't seem like adequate justice, to me at least. Here's an interview from the study that I referenced earlier, from one of where I interviewed 22 survivors of either sexual or domestic violence or both, and I asked them to imagine what justice would mean to them. The first advice I got was, by the way, this was Mary Walsh was a survivor of domestic violence who had actually gone to court to try to hold her perpetrator accountable. And she says, you won't matter. You're not, what your wishes are not really being taken into account. There's a whole bureaucracy, and you're just a kind of a little cog in a big machine. From my point of view, if you intentionally wanted to design a way of aggravating post-traumatic stress disorder, you couldn't do better than a court of law, at least in our country, because the things that victims need for their recovery and the things that are required of them in the justice system are diametrically opposed. Victims need a sense of safety and protection by publicly denouncing the perpetrator. Of course, they run an increased risk of retaliation. Excuse me. Victims need acknowledgement of what happened to them, but if they dare to speak up, their credibility is going to be challenged by the perpetrator and his defenders. Victims need to be treated with dignity, but in an adversarial court system, they're risking constant humiliation and shaming. Victims need to establish some sense of power and control over their situation, but courts have their own rules and procedures, and which victims may often not even understand. And instead of being able to develop over time a personal narrative of the trauma that integrates what happened into an ongoing life story, the kinds of questioning that victims are going to undergo in court involve yes or no questions, and do you remember the exact date and the exact time and the exact place, and if you don't, why don't you, and so on. And finally, instead of avoiding reminders of the trauma, the direct confrontation with the perpetrator is going to bring up every possible reminder. So we don't have a justice system that takes into account certainly the psychological stresses that survivors have to endure. A lot of talk in the last couple of decades about the possibilities of restorative justice that would be more, possibly more victim-centered, where the focus is on the harm instead of on the laws that are broken. There's more initiative given to the victim. The process is more consensus than adversarial. The remedy is restitution and restoration rather than punishment of the perpetrator. And the victim is more central, possibly. I think many restorative justice programs have been developed really with the focus on the offender, a better form of justice for the offender rather than for the victim. And victims have come into consideration only more recently. So there's a lot of debate about whether such initiatives would be more helpful for victims. But I think this is, there's some promise here, but it requires, certainly for crimes of sexual exploitation, it requires a kind of community commitment that I don't think is there at present and would have to be organized. So let me tell you a bit more about the study and share some of the wisdom of the people I interviewed. What I found, first of all, is that people have very individualized ideas about what justice means, but there were some points of commonality and even consensus. And those I'd like to summarize for you because I think they help us envision what's needed as we organize for the future. First of all was acknowledgement. Every single survivor said, we need the truth. The truth needs to be known, the truth needs to be acknowledged. And what was most important to the survivors was not necessarily acknowledgement by the perpetrator, but acknowledgement by the community. And that was true both of acknowledging the facts of what happened, that is, survivors wanted to be believed, but also acknowledgement of the harm that was done, because oftentimes the rationalizations and excuses that the perpetrators offer are, first of all, the victims lying or the victims fantasizing, the victims, a little emotionally unstable, So you can't believe the victim, but then if the facts are established, then, so what is she complaining about? Why is she so weak? It's, you know, it's over and done with, and let's move on. So it was terribly important for everyone to feel that the community both recognized the truth of what happened and recognized the harm and denounced the crime. That basically, I think, and we see this so clearly with our survivors of child sexual abuse, the hurt, the deepest hurt in many ways is not what the perpetrator did, but what the community and the family did not do. The failure to protect, the failure to recognize what was going on, or the collusion of the family with the perpetrator. And so to have the community say this was wrong, and we support, we denounce the harm that was done, was terribly important to everyone. There was kind of mixed feelings about whether an apology was wanted, and I'll say more about that. And mixed feelings about what would be fair restitution. But by and large, there was, with very few exceptions, there was very little interest in punishment of the perpetrator. There was much more interest in preventing future harm. And those who wanted the perpetrator imprisoned really rationalized this on the grounds that he'd done it to many other children, and he was going to keep doing it. And there was really no way to contain him other than imprisonment. Revenge, people I interviewed specifically looking for fantasies and desires for revenge, and tried to create an interview situation where it was permitted for people to talk about that. But I found that there was very little interest in revenge, and when people did think about revenge, they felt almost as though their revenge fantasies were kind of, they were not, as we call it, they were not egocentric, as we say. They felt like some alien presence that had been implanted by the perpetrator. There was also not very much interest in forgiveness. And I'll say a little bit more about that. So here's an example from one of the interviews of just what was most important, that I want people to know who he is and what he did. And this survivor could be speaking, I think, for the unanimous consensus of the group. Here, Ross Chait, who was willing to be identified by name, is a professor of political science at Brown University, and he's also a survivor of childhood sexual abuse in a youth chorus. The choir director had multiple victims. And he sued the choir for damages, and the perpetrator also. Now, the judge not only ruled in his favor, but put a very high monetary value on the damages. And Ross said, you know, he knew he was never going to see the money, but he felt supported by the community, that the community really understood how hurt he had been. And he felt seen. And it was an incredibly important part of his healing. I'm sharing this quote for a couple of reasons. Sarah Johnson, who was a nurse, when I was asking what she felt about what she thought should happen to the perpetrator, she first talked about how she wanted him to feel the worst pain, and then and how she could never forgive. And then a minute later she said, you know, if he were to say, I'm sorry, it would make all the difference. She said, I'm a nurse, I take care of people who could be just the same as him. So she was kind of reconnecting with his humanity. And this, by the way, is a serial rapist who assaulted her. Someone who, you know, was a young acquaintance. She was a high school student when this happened. And who had, when she did press charges and found that he had done this to several other girls, and no one had come forward till she did. Or that is to say, they had complained to the police, but then been afraid to press charges. So the detective had told her that this was a serial rapist. And there's something magic about apologies. It's as though if the person makes a genuine statement of remorse, the bitterness and vengeful feelings kind of melt away without struggle, sort of spontaneously. And so here she is imagining that a true apology would help her let go of her bitter feelings. A quote from George Orwell, who knew a thing or two about abuses of power. And he understands that the desire for revenge is the fantasy of a powerless person. Whereas when one actually has power to inflict revenge, it just becomes disgusting and pathetic, as he says. It doesn't satisfy. It doesn't remedy the hurt. It doesn't repair the harm. It doesn't help. This is a drawing by an artist named Amy Bradford, also a rape survivor. She talked about how she had horrible fantasies about shooting the perpetrator, somebody she knew from her art class. And so she did a drawing of the fantasy of raping, of shooting the rapist. Here's the rapist. Here she is as the rape victim. And then she draws a picture of grief. She calls this a vengeance of sorts. And in the background are pictures of all the victims of gun violence, which is a scourge in our country because guns are so readily available. So at the same time as she has vengeful fantasies, she grieves. Then there's the problem of the insincere apology. Caroline, who is an incest survivor, talks about what happens if you have an apology that is not based on empathy or acknowledgement of harm, but based on some other motive. So you have, under the insincere apology, the typical insincere apology is the sort of what I call the politician's apology. I'm very sorry if anyone was offended. You know, not if I did something, but if anybody was so wimpy that they were hurt in any way. And using the passive voice always, if something happened. And here's Caroline, who imagines that actually the perpetrator would get a kick out of, or perhaps be sexually excited by talking about what he did. And she says she would feel slimed all over again. And then she says, because this is a family situation, if he apologized, then the family would pressure her to forgive. And with an insincere apology, there is no spontaneous forgiveness. Rather, an insincere apology is just adding insult to injury. Let's talk a little bit about what accountability might look like if the society were serious about holding perpetrators accountable. And actually, this is one advance in our country that I like to share when I speak internationally, because not many people know about this model, and yet I think it is the beginning of making amends on a social scale rather than an individual scale. And that is a Crime Victims Fund that was established in our country by the Victims of Crime Act. And this was a fund that was created based on fines imposed on criminal offenders. And so the offenders had to offenders who are convicted of any crime are required to pay into a fund that serves victims. And it serves victims in many different ways. One is directly by paying, for example, for medical bills, for both physical injuries and psychological, paying for psychotherapy. It also pays for lost wages if victims lose time from work. So it's compensation for individual victims, and then it also funds services for crime victims more generally. So in our country, the Victims of Crime Act Fund is a major source of support for our rape crisis centers, our battered women's shelters, our victim advocacy for abused kids, treatment programs for abused kids. So we have a way in which perpetrators as a group can give back to victims as a group. And the advantage here, of course, is that, you know, if one victim sues one perpetrator in civil court, he may or may not have any money to, and that's just kind of random. But this way, victims can feel if they benefit from the fund, that perpetrators as a group have contributed to their healing. So I hold that up as one model of how we might begin to think about making restitution. And I also wanted to give you a little bit of a window into a better intervention program that was developed again by the program in Duluth, Minnesota that created the violence wheel that I showed you. Because it's been very widely disseminated, and I think it's a pretty good model for, again, how one might hold perpetrators accountable if we were serious about it. And here the nonviolence wheel comes into play, where in contrast to the wheel of power and control, this is the wheel of equality, and perpetrators are schooled in what it means to respect your partner, to not to resort to any threatening behavior, to share responsibility, and so forth. So the program basically holds, it's a group program that holds men accountable by assuming that violence is something they choose to do and that they can choose not to do. It's only, the men are only eligible for the program if the abused women, if there's provision for their safety, of restraining orders in place and actively enforced by the court, and people from the program are in touch regularly with the victim to make sure that she and the children feel safe. And in the group, members confront each other's rationalizations and excuses. They understand them very well because they use the same ones. The participation has to be ordered by the court. Men do not volunteer for this kind of program. I would also emphasize that this is for domestic violence. We don't yet have anything comparable that involves incest and sexual abuse, because there's another layer of compulsivity there that it's not clear that we have effective interventions to control. But this, you can conceive of this as a form of reintegrative shaming, where the burden of shame is really lifted from the victims and placed on the shoulders of the perpetrator where it belongs. And this is a quote from John Braithwaite, who is a major theorist of restorative justice. So here is a way that men who are eligible can be assigned to this kind of program rather than to something more punitive. And there are actually some good outcome data from multiple sites looking at reoffending or reassault. Basically, at the 2-year follow-up showing that it's down under 2%, which is pretty good. So finally, I do want to say a little bit about forgiveness, because just as victims in some ways disavowed revenge, for the most part they were not interested in forgiveness in the sense of repairing the relationship with the perpetrator. And again, some of the exception may be more for situations of domestic violence, where the victims don't necessarily want to give up the relationship, they just want the violence to stop and controlling behavior to stop, if that can be done. So, but unless there's genuine remorse and restitution and genuine apology, forgiveness is a very heavy lift. This is a quote from a rape survivor named Mary Margaret Giannini, who became an attorney as a way of helping other survivors. She said, no, I don't want reconciliation with him. He doesn't need my forgiveness, he needs his creator's forgiveness. I thought that was a wonderful way of thinking about it. She said, I don't want to be part of his recovery process. What people did, here's Mary Walsh again saying, if by forgiveness one means just letting go of bitterness and letting go of revenge fantasies, letting go of nursing grievance, then lots of people wanted to do that. As Mary Walsh says, giving up all hope of a better past. What people wanted in terms of reconciliation, much more, was reconciliation with the bystanders, with the people, with the community, with the families, with the people who stood by and didn't help. So here's another survivor, Anne-Marie Hunter, saying, let's think about how to move perpetrators to contrition and change behavior. And that's the charge that I think survivors place upon us as a wider community. How are we going to take seriously our responsibility, not to be passive bystanders, not to be passively complicit, but to take a proactive stance to place controls on the behavior of perpetrators who exploit as part of their sense of entitlement to power and control over the subordinate group. So I will leave you with a graphic, again, from our National Crime Victims' Rights Week. That's also something that we have now each year as a result of our Victims of Crime Act. We have an office for victims of crime within our Justice Department, a National Center for Victims of Crime with a hotline. And I think it is all about bringing honor to victims and by our engagement that we respect and we respect their suffering and we commit ourselves to their healing. So let me leave you there with a little time for some questions.